Hello and welcome into DAV Podcast, episode number 14. Today we are talking about suicide by lethal means. Welcome in. I'm Dan Claskins along with Ashley Burns, and over the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to talk to some great guests on this topic, a very important topic. Veteran suicide is something that has been a problem for some time, and during 2020, seemingly not improving, COVID-19 and everything else out there. And Ashley, it's always important to, first of all, let people know that need help. They can get help. And that's what we're here to do today.
Yeah, we know that, as you mentioned, because the COVID pandemic and the social isolation people are experiencing, the situation certainly isn't improving anytime soon. And we want to make sure that veterans who are in crisis are able to get connected to the resources that they need. And I always like to throw out the Veterans Crisis Line number, just in case someone out there listening is able to make that connection or their loved one is. So veterans or family members, they can call 1-800-273-8255 and press 1 if you're a veteran to immediately be connected with someone who can help.
Talking to just people in general is always a good thing. Getting those help and resources. We've got other resources available for, if you need help with your benefits and such like that. But at the time of crisis, knowing that this counseling's out there, and there's a lot of good things going on in the space as well, Ashley, in terms of suicide prevention. And we have a slew of guests here today that can speak on the matter more specifically. We'll get to that in a minute. If you're new to the podcast, though, we urge you to subscribe to it, follow the podcast. You can get us anytime, dav.org/podcast. You can also subscribe wherever you listen, whether it's iTunes or Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, and many more. And, go to dav.org. If you need some help, you can learn about all of our various programs and services. But in terms of suicide and veteran suicide today, we're really just going to learn, a lot of what is going on out there, and specifically lethal means, suicide by lethal means. Ashley, let's talk a little bit what that's about.
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting conversation that's starting to percolate, and we're seeing a lot more experts start to get into this concept of lethal means safety. And when we talk about lethal means, you think of the things that may be potentially used to inflict self-harm, whether that's firearms, whether that's prescription medication. There are a number of things that we can do to help mitigate those risks. And, having these difficult conversations, it's not always easy. It can be very difficult to address the topic head on, but we've seen, and studies have shown, that this is a very effective means of preventing suicide, is to be able to have those conversations with a veteran and to, before the time of crisis happens, make a plan, whether that's making sure that firearms are safely stored, whether that's making sure that expired medication or unused medication is properly disposed of. It's an incredibly important part of creating that time and space between having suicidal ideation and actually acting out on those ideas. So with us today, we have Dr. Russell Lemley, who's a senior policy analyst for the Veterans Healthcare Policy Institute. And he's going to talk to us about the importance of lethal means safety in the fight against veteran suicide.
Hi there, I'm Mary with DAV, and today I'm talking with Dr. Russell Lemley. He is Senior Policy Analyst for Veterans Healthcare Policy Institute. Dr. Lemley, thank you for joining me today. We're talking about an extremely important topic that affects so many of us, whether we served or we love someone who served, and that is lethal means safety. When we discuss lethal means safety, what does that mean?
So, Mary, thank you and DAV for inviting me. It is an extremely important topic. So historically, the term lethal means safety refers to strategies to create time and space between a person with suicidal thoughts and access to a highly fatal method of self-harm. When we create moments of pause, that allows the period of heightened risk to pass, and the suicide rate often drops. Now, in our country, lethal means safety often, but not always, pertains to counseling safe storage of firearms, since guns are the most common lethal means used in half of all U.S. deaths by suicide and 2/3 of veteran suicides. It's important to note that there's no single cause of suicide. It is the outcome of multiple contributing factors and events, and access to lethal means is one of the environmental factors that increases the risk. It's also worth mentioning that we're not talking about guns per se, or even about most gun owners, but only when guns are accessible as a means to harm oneself.
Well, how could developing that understanding of what that means, how can that affect the suicide rate of veterans in our country?
So that's an incredibly important question, and I have a fair amount to say in answering. So U.S. veterans are at elevated risk of suicide, especially firearm suicide. In 2017, which is the last year that we have data, approximately 17 veterans died by suicide per day. Now, to put that in another perspective, nearly as many veterans die by suicide each year as the total number of service members who were killed in action during the decades-long Iraq and Afghanistan operations. Firearms are by far the most common means used by veterans who die by suicide, and approximately 71% of male veteran suicide deaths and 43% of female veteran suicide deaths are caused by firearms. The availability of firearms at home triples the risk of dying by suicide. And while for some individuals, suicide attempts are contemplated and planned for a while, that's not true for the majority of people. For most individuals, a definitive decision to act is impulsive. Surveys have found that a large percentage of people who survive suicide attempts began their attempt only minutes or hours after making the decision. And the high-risk acute phase of many suicidal crises arises quickly and is fleeting. Most critically, we know that reducing the ease by which at-risk individuals can access firearms has been shown to prevent suicide. For example, when the Israeli Defense Forces began requiring soldiers to store their firearms on base before going on weekend leave, there were significant decreases in weekend suicides, and the overall suicide rate dropped 40%. So the evidence is very clear that delaying access to firearms saves lives during high-risk periods. Storage or transfer of firearms out of the home is the safest option, but we know that may not be acceptable or feasible for some veterans. Let me just mention some off-site options include a friend or a relative, provided that they aren't prohibited from possessing firearms, a storage facility where ammunition can be stored separately, police departments, pawn shops, gun stores, gun clubs, and some in-home safe storage options includes storing guns unloaded, separating guns and ammunition, giving the lock key to someone else, storing guns in a safe, asking someone to change the safe combination, or temporarily disassembling a gun.
So, but to be clear, we're not only talking about firearms, right? When we talk about lethal means safety, what are some other safety precautions we're discussing here?
And right, medications, of course, are another lethal means that are used for attempting suicide. So we would be talking as well about medication storage. It's probably the second most common means, and we really are talking about any means that an individual might potentially use to harm themselves.
So when we talk about those medication and firearms and things like that, there seems to be a lot of misunderstanding or fears or just not understanding what we mean by it. How do you respond to those?
There are four major misunderstandings and fears about what lethal means safety entails. Let me go through them. So the first misconception is that it doesn't work because someone in crisis will find one means or another for self-harm. If somebody really wants to die by suicide, there's nothing that you can do about it. The second misconception is that lethal means safety puts individual liberties at stake, that changing one's firearm storage or transferring one's guns would be involuntary. The third misconception is that storage changes would be permanent, that if you transfer your guns, you won't be able to get them returned. And the last is that the VA uses this policy to grab guns. And that's a pretty common misperception, as a fifth of post 9/11 veterans inaccurately believe that seeking VA care, mental health care, would result in the potential of having their firearms confiscated. So let's go through all those misconceptions. People who are thwarted don't tend to keep trying. Of individuals who survive an attempt, over 2/3 never attempt again. and less than a quarter reattempt non-fatally, and only 10% eventually die by suicide. So if you help a person survive the immediate crisis and suicidal intent by keeping a firearm safely stored, then you go a long way towards saving a life. Deciding to limit one's personal access to firearms when it feels appropriate is no threat to Second Amendment rights. It's completely voluntary. Decision is made collaboratively between a veteran and his or her family, friends, or counselor. The change in storage is only temporary until the crisis passes. But most significantly, what I really want to emphasize here and help people realize is that the National Shooting Sports Foundation, who's the firearm industry trade association, is 100% behind temporarily restricting access to firearms for those at risk of suicide. They're working closely with the VA to guide policy so that any discussion of safe storage is in accord with one's personal reasons for owning firearms. And there are many other firearms organizations who support voluntarily limited access to firearms as a means to reduce suicide. So among those include the Second Amendment organization, who espoused that responsible gun ownership includes the voluntary elimination of access to firearms during times of acute crisis. The U.S. Concealed Carry Association sponsored a recent firearm suicide prevention video webinar. Hold My Guns, which is an organization led by members of the gun community, work with ranges and retailers for storing guns at the request of gun owners in mental health crises and for other issues as well. Walk the Talk America is an organization founded by gun industry leaders who endeavor to reduce firearm suicide by educating gun community members and mental health professionals. Altogether, these suggest that we've really arrived at a point that being an accountable firearm owner is ensuring that we take action to prevent suicides among our veterans, and not to mention really all of our brothers and sisters.
So then the fears and the misunderstandings are not warranted based on the research.
That's what I would say. And yet they're prevalent. So, one of the reasons I was happy to be on this podcast is just to point out that they're widespread, and yet it'd be really helpful to understand what in fact is and is not lethal means safety policy.
So what can we do to help prevent veteran suicide? You mentioned so much about lethal means safety, about voluntarily giving up or safe storage of your weapons. How do you know if it's time?
Let me talk for a moment about the Friends Don't Let Friends Drive Drunk and the designated driver campaigns that have empowered family and friends to protect one another. And you'll see in a moment why I want to do that. Since their inception in 1982, 2/3 of Americans have tried to prevent someone from driving after drinking. And traffic deaths involving alcohol-impaired crashes on our nation's highways have decreased by 65%. That's what we're referring to with veterans who are in crisis. We want to encourage friends and family to talk with those in crisis about storing their firearms safely during the crisis. And the emphasis that it's a personal strength and not failing to talk about storing guns until a crisis passes. In-home and out-of-home storage changes, should be considered whenever someone's at risk for suicide or self-harm. And warning signs of that risk, and let me just kind of go through for your audience to say kind of 6 or 8 different signs. So expression of suicidal thoughts, feelings, or behavior would be obviously a key sign. Expression of feelings of hopelessness or being a burden to others, also fairly common. Changes in usual patterns of behavior, self-isolating, a recent major life event such as a divorce, a job loss, or financial trouble, increased use of alcohol or drugs, reckless or violent behavior, and a history of serious mental illness. So those are the most common warning signs that you'd be alert to. And let me just add again that the National Shooting Sports Foundation advocates having what they call brave conversations, with those individuals about reducing access to firearms, including temporarily transferring to a trusted family member or friend. NSF promotes, this secure storage of firearms, as well as other methods of harming oneself, can play a huge role in deterring suicide.
Well, and I know you mentioned it earlier, but I feel like it's so important to remind people too. If you voluntarily store or take these precautions because you are concerned about your own mental health or you are going through something, you could get your weapons back, right? Like what is that, and where's the fear there, and how or when is it justified?
So the short answer is yes, this is voluntary, this is temporary, and depending upon where you transfer or how you store. So your question, of course, has to do with out of the home transfer. Mm-hmm. Obviously, in-home safety precautions are quite different than what we were just talking about. But so in situations out of the home, there are procedures in some states, and depending upon where you stored it, that you may have to go through just so that there is the proper kind of legal channels for the retrieval. In some states, those barriers don't exist. So you're right that in some states there are extra steps when you'd like to have it returned to you. For example, if it goes to a pawn shop in certain states, there's a clearance in terms of returning to you. But in most instances, and in many states, that's really not the case. The same thing in terms of what at least formally happens in some states with certain individuals that you may transfer. I think the other thing that has confused individuals and veterans is that I believe at this point it's 13 states, there are extreme risk protection legislation that allows for individuals who are deemed to be suicidal to have their firearms involuntarily removed during the crisis. But we're not actually talking about that. Lethal means safety has basically no bearing on these so-called red flag laws, because really this, for lethal means safety as a procedure, it really is completely voluntary on the individual's part in terms of transferring their firearms, and that's assuming it's out of the home. And this has actually no overlap with those other laws.
Who can veterans and or their families and friends who may be concerned about them, who can they talk to get their questions answered before they take any action? It's like, what are some of the resources, or if I have questions particular to my jurisdiction, who can I ask so that these fears and misunderstandings are squashed and we can really focus on the big issue, which is preventing veteran suicide?
The fears and misunderstandings could be addressed in a number of different ways. And maybe one of the better ways is that the VA itself has a center in Denver as part of their suicide kind of research and education center. I can send to DAV the link to them so that there is a way that they could both be called and they can be emailed for questions. The Suicide Prevention Resource Center, which is kind of not just for veterans, has information about this. So does the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. So does the National Shooting Sports Foundation that I was mentioning earlier. There are other resources as well. 3 states, Colorado, Maryland, and Washington, have an online directory for out-of-home firearms storage. And again, those are all voluntary storage situations where where firearms can be temporarily stored during crises. All those are resources that have to do with lethal means safety. I've been negligent if I didn't also just mention that, of course, these are all situations in which there is some concern about veteran and self-harm. And I want to just put a plug in for the Veterans Crisis Line, while we're talking. And that number is 1-800-273-8255. And you would press 1. I'll say it again, 1-800-273-8255. Press 1. And again, you'll be talking with a trained responder.
What else would you like to add for anyone who may have fears for someone or might be scared to ask for help?
Well, of course, if it's scared to ask for help is that, talking with the crisis line is always a good start. And you don't have to wait until it's really an acute crisis. They're available 24/7. One of the things I'd like to add to kind of this whole conversation is just to stress that suicide can be prevented. I was talking about some of the research earlier and really want to make sure that that was one of the take-homes. Safe storage strategies are effective for preventing suicide, and they also honor, as I've said, the voluntary nature and an inherent respect for responsible firearms ownership. It is possible to have this kind of policy implemented that's still, just as I said, is inherently respectful of firearm ownership. As a side note, I also want to add that it's worth noting this can reduce risk of suicide or injury for everyone in the home, because safe storage as a home safety measure is good for everyone. This is about creating distance and time to give a moment of pause, knowing that for many, this isn't necessarily true for everyone, but for many individuals, that's enough to create the space and before there's any actual action taken to harm oneself. So creating the space and the distance and the time, it can be life-saving.
That's really the goal. That's really the goal. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Lemley. I appreciate everything you're doing.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Mary.
Hi, everybody. This is Ashley with DAV. I am so pleased to be joined today by DAV Assistant Legislative Director Marquis Bearfield. Marquis, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Ashley. Thank you. And this is a wonderful day in DAV for the things that we're going to discuss today.
Yeah, so Marquis, he's one of our legislative folks here in DC, and one of his portfolios that he handles as far as advocacy is concerned is suicide prevention. So something, we're all very clearly, interested in. We're trying to make sure we're doing everything we can to bolster those suicide prevention efforts. So we want to talk a little bit about veteran suicide prevention today and some of the legislation to address it. Marquis, can you tell me about the two bills? We'll go ahead and start with the Commander John Scott Hannon Veterans Mental Health Care Improvement Act, kind of a mouthful, but packed with some really important stuff. I know there's some important provisions in there for improving access to mental health care, for opening the doors in how we treat mental health conditions, as well as transitioning from military to civilian life. So can you talk a little bit about that and touch on some of those finer points for me?
Yes, I can. As most of us are well aware, 20 veterans die by suicide a day. And of those 20, about 14 do not have direct access to VA care or VA treatment. One of the big things that happened this weekend was the president signed into law Senate Bill 785, the Commander John Scott Hannon Mental Health Care and Suicide Prevention Act. And there are 6 major points that bolster this particular piece of legislation. One of them is VA's mental health workforce to serve more veterans by offering scholarships to mental health professionals to work at VA centers or vet centers, and placing at least one suicide prevention coordinator at every VA medical center. Some other key points from that bill are improving rural veterans' access to mental health care as well, along with implementing a pilot program to provide veterans to access to complementary and interrogative health care programs through animal therapy, sports and recreation therapy, and therapy and other art therapy and post-traumatic growth therapy. It also establishes a grant program that requires the VA to better collaborate with community organizations across the country that serve veterans. So it opens the door for community care networks to be available when a veteran is having a mental health crisis and they can't get specifically to either a VA medical center or a clinic. They can get to a place out in their local communities to get the care and assistance that they need. And it also holds the VA accountable for its mental health care and suicide prevention efforts by examining how the Department of Veterans Affairs manages suicide prevention resources at their various facilities across the country.
Yeah, I mean, it really is a very comprehensive piece. I mean, there's so much involved there. Clearly, we know that, VA is a great place for veterans. On the whole, the quality of care there is, proven. It's study after study has shown that it's very good, very high quality. But we have seen that the issue, of course, is actually getting access to that and getting people in the door. So making sure that we're meeting veterans where they are in the community, that no matter where they are, if they're in crisis, we're able to get them help. That's very important.
Yes, it is very important because a lot, like I said, a lot of veterans who have thought about it, or have mental health issues or have concerns with suicide, we're trying to make sure, or the VA is trying to make sure that there are ways that they can get back into the VA healthcare system. As you indicated earlier, we understand that the VA is the leader in mental health care for veterans, and we want to make sure that they know and understand that, hey, if there is an issue, please, by all means, go to your local VA, talk with your primary care physician, or go to your community-based outpatient clinic or vet center, whatever is most easier or prevalent for you to get to. Make sure that you take advantage of your VA benefits and know that they are there to help you.
Right. And the next thing we'll talk about actually kind of plays into that as well. It's making sure that, again, no matter where you are, help is available to you. And I think the important thing too, that we talk about this community prevention effort, is making sure that everyone knows and understands where to send a veteran who's in crisis. So the National Suicide Hotline Designation Act, tell me a little bit about what that does and what does the timeline look like for implementation of that?
The National Suicide Hotline Prevention Act will designate the numbers 988 in an emergency situation for mental health or suicide prevention crisis. And this designation was signed into law on Saturday as well. And this piece of legislation will designate the numbers 988, just like 911 for any type of emergency. But this one's for specifically mental health or suicide prevention. So instead of having to remember the former number, the long 10-digit 1-800 number, this particular piece of legislation will allow a person or a veteran to be able to just call 988 and specify, once you call those digits, that if you push the option 1, you'll be connected with a veterans crisis counselor, and they will intervene and take it from there. The piece of legislation that was signed into law on Saturday should be implemented over the next 2 years. So by 2022, 988 will be the new designated number to call if you know someone or if you are a veteran that is having a mental health or suicide prevention crisis. You can call that number and help and assistance will be with you, just like with dialing 911.
Marky, I want to thank you for taking the time again to discuss this really important issue. Some great legislation that will hopefully help us battle against veteran suicide as we move forward. You can be sure to go to davcan.org. It's the DAV Commanders Action Network. You can see the legislation that is backed by DAV, including a number of bills that you can help us take action on to address this crucial issue of veterans' mental health care and suicide prevention. So again, thank you, Marquis, for a great conversation. Please be sure to check out davcan.org, learn a little bit more about how you can take action with us. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ashley. Really appreciate the conversation this morning.
That was a great update there and a nice wrap up to today's episode. Lots of things to consider. And once again, just putting it out there, if you are a veteran or anybody, anybody that might need help and talk to suicide through that with a trained expert, veterans and their loved ones can call 1-800-273-8255. Press 1. That will get you through, and definitely reach out for the help you need. As far as the podcast, we'd love to have you keep listening. So subscribe to us, keep up with things. You can do so on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever you listen. DAV.org/podcast. That's the home of it all the time. And you can get all the episodes we've done from day one, our live day episode, all the way through this 14 episodes sitting out there for you. And certainly you want to follow us on Facebook. You can do that. We like us on Facebook, I should say, and follow us on Twitter and Instagram for sure. Check out the YouTube page. And most importantly, if you need help with your benefits or looking for some jobs or just a veteran, with some assistance needed, check out DAV.org there for all of our programs and services. And you can always help us help veterans by making a donation as well. Ashley, as we start up 2021 here and look ahead to what's coming up in the podcast, lots of things we want to talk about, but I'd be interested to see what others might want to hear in the upcoming year as well.
Yeah, exactly. I always love a little audience participation, and we know that there are topics that are important to you. One of the best places that we get our inspiration for what we talk about here, for what we advocate for on Capitol Hill, it all comes from our members, from our veterans, and from you, from our listeners. So if you have some ideas of a story, of a concept, of a new piece of technology, I mean, it can be anything. Sky's the limit. Shoot us a line at feedback@dav.org. We would absolutely love to hear from you. If you like the show, if you have suggestions for the show, we'd really be happy to take all of those suggestions, and just let us know what you think of us.
Absolutely. Happy New Year to everyone out there. Indeed, we're looking forward to some big things ahead and helping veterans this year and beyond. So for all of us here at DAV, for Ashley Burns, I'm Dan Claskins. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you next time right here on the DAV Podcast.